the end of summer, along with a small group, I spent a week rafting down Alaska's Copper River. I encountered rushing rapids, colossal glaciers, inquisitive bears, and some of the most beautiful places I have ever seen. The Copper River rises at the roots of a 14,000-foot volcano and runs nearly 300 miles through southeast Alaska, traversing some of the most rugged and remote terrain in North America. Locked in ice for more than half the year, the river springs to life during the brief and brilliant Alaskan summer, fed by the meltwater of dozens of glaciers. With few settlements along its course, and only a handful of towns in its entire basin, the river looks much as it did in the late 19th century when it was first mapped by American explorers. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Copper Valley witnessed one of the most ambitious railroad projects ever attempted. But the tracks were abandoned long ago, and now there are few signs of civilization, besides the occasional rafting party. We launched our rafts at Chitna, where the Copper River plunges into the mountains. Here, as throughout its lower course, the scale of the river is impressive. During summer and fall, the Copper is the 10th largest river in the United States by volume. At its highest, the river's flow approaches 400,000 cubic feet per second, roughly 2/3 the average discharge of the Mississippi. For such a large river, the Copper has a remarkably steep gradient, and its current is correspondingly swift. We launched our rafts into that racing water, and almost immediately entered Wood Canyon, one of several points where the river, elsewhere often a mile or more wide, is compressed to a narrow channel by cliffs, and the sheer volume of water rushing through creates standing waves and whirlpools. On the far side of Wood Canyon, we emerged into a spectacular mountain valley. We camped the first night beneath Spirit Mountain, which rises a vertical mile almost straight from the river's banks. The second day, we encountered the infamous Copper River wind. The Copper Valley is a natural wind tunnel, especially in winter, when gusts that sometimes top 100 miles an hour whip up howling ground blizzards. In summer and fall, the strongest winds tend to accompany storms moving in from the Gulf of Alaska, and it was one of these systems that pelted us with horizontal rain for most of the afternoon. We made camp across the river from a small glacier. There are hundreds like it in this part of Alaska, so many, in fact, that no exact count exists. These mountains are among the snowiest places on Earth. All that snow builds up in alpine valleys, settles, coalesces, and creeps downhill as glacier ice. As we continued down the river the next day, we saw several more glaciers, in a landscape that dwarfed our rafts. That afternoon, we encountered remains of the old Copper River and Northwestern Railway, which I explore in another video. After the railroad was closed in 1938, long sections of track were simply left to rot. They're still there today, draped over the shore. We also found one of the section houses, half collapsed into a creek. Our next camp was near the Copper's confluence with the Tasnuna River in a spectacular mountain amphitheater. On the fourth day, the Copper became wider and shallower, its water sifting through a maze of braided channels. As we wound between the sandbars, the sky darkened and the first of many downpours descended on our rafts. During a lull, we hiked a short distance into the Bremner sand dunes, several square miles of undulating sand hills formed in the bed of the vast lake that filled the Copper Valley at the end of the last ice age. The dunes may have been partly submerged as recently as a few centuries ago, when glacial advances dammed the river. But now, they're shaped only by the wind. After a very wet afternoon, we camped near the entrance of Bayard Canyon. The rain finally stopped on the morning of the 5th day as we entered the canyon and plunged toward Abercrombie Rapids, where a stiff upstream wind whistled over the waves. Then, all at once, we found ourselves in Miles Lake. Miles Lake is really just a wide spot on the Copper River, created by the retreat of Miles Glacier. That gargantuan river of ice, more than 30 miles long, still looms over the lake's eastern side, calving fleets of icebergs. As we drew closer to the glacier, icebergs began to appear, radioactive blue in the tentative sunlight. On the other side of the lake gleamed another glacier, half hidden by rain. This was Childs Glacier, and in front of it, impossibly small, stood the $1 Million Bridge, the critical link in the old Copper River Railway. We passed beneath the bridge and approached Childs Glacier, which towers 300 feet over the river. For the next 2 nights, we camped opposite the glacier, which groaned and thundered and threw huge masses of ice into the river. In past years, when the ice was closer, waves from these calvings were sometimes large enough to swamp the campground itself. Over the next 2 days, despite constant rain and gusty winds, I spent hours on the $1 Million Bridge. Partly to take footage for my video on the construction of the Copper River Railway, but mostly because I was fascinated by the procession of icebergs passing underfoot. On day 6, some of us bushwhacked through the alders and Devil's Club to the face of Childs Glacier and climbed onto the rain-slicked ice. The following morning, after a last look at the Gothic majesty of the glacier, we joined the icebergs floating downstream. Almost immediately, we entered the Copper River Delta, larger than Rhode Island. Thick mist made it seem an eerie place, where rain hissed on leafless trees and icebergs rolled like dying whales. The mountains emerged briefly to peer through the clouds with the indifference of geological time. And then, sooner than I had expected, we reached our takeout point at the broken bridge that ends the Copper River Highway. I peeled off my dry suit, threw my muddy duffel into the waiting van, and clambered inside. As we started the long drive to Cordova, I looked back toward Childs Glacier, glowing in the distance. Then the river and horizon merged and sank together in a gray infinity of rain. Please consider subscribing to this channel for more videos about travel, usually with a historical theme. Feel free to take a look at my book and Patreon. And as always, thanks for watching.